The grand chandelier of Aurelia, suspended like a galaxy of frozen tears 75 floors above the Chicago skyline, did not so much as tremble. The murmur of the city's elite, a low thrum of money and power, continued unabated. Every diner was a titan of industry. Every glass held a vintage worth more than a monthly salary, and every plate was a meticulously constructed work of art. Yet, in this temple of opulence, a single fork had just clattered to the floor, the sound swallowed by the thick Aubusson carpet. The man in the corner booth, Julian Croft, a real estate mogul whose name was carved into the city's steel and glass heart, was smirking. He believed he had won. He had no idea the young woman he'd just humiliated, the waitress he'd dismissed as nothing more than an insignificant cog in his world, was the one person who held the power to not just end his meal, but to detonate the very foundation of his empire. As the restaurant's owner begins to stride across the dining room, a storm of his own making is gathering around him, and the prime cut of beef on his plate is about to become the trigger for his spectacular downfall. What happens next will not just shift the balance of power, it will shatter it so completely that by the time the truth is served, his entire world will already be a smoldering ruin. Clara Evans hated the squeak of her issued non-slip shoes. It was a sound of servitude, a constant reminder of the chasm between her reality and her aspirations. Tonight, the squeak felt particularly grating. Rain hammered against the panoramic windows of Aurelia, the city lights below bleeding into a watercolor of neon and shadow. Inside, the air was warm, scented with truffle oil, seared scallops, and the faint, crisp smell of old money. Clara moved through the labyrinth of tables with a practiced grace, her movements economical and precise. She was exhausted. Her days were spent in a sterile university lab, coaxing secrets from protein chains and lipid structures for her doctoral thesis in food science. Her nights were spent here, balancing trays, refilling water glasses, and perfecting an expression of serene invisibility. Dressed in a starched black uniform, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, Clara looked like every other waitress. She didn't carry the weary entitlement of the clientele, nor the polished, almost predatory ambition of the management. She looked like a young woman simply trying to make rent, a ghost in the machine of fine dining. In her locker, beneath her worn coat, sat a dog-eared copy of Advanced Food Chemistry, its pages filled with her frantic annotations. That book was her real life. This was just the funding for it. She approached the best table in the house, booth 12, a curved expanse of plush crimson leather overlooking the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. It was Julian Croft's table. He was a man in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and then left out in a harsh wind. His suit was a custom Xenia, dark as a starless night, and a Vacheron Constantin watch, a piece of intricate machinery worth more than her entire PhD funding, was a casual weight on his wrist. He was celebrating. The whispers had been circulating all night. Croft had just closed the landmark deal for the new Lakeshore Spire, a controversial project that would displace thousands, but would add another gleaming, sterile monument to his legacy. He was surrounded by a trio of younger men, sycophants who laughed too loudly at his jokes and nodded vigorously at his pronouncements. Clara had been dreading this all evening. Croft was notoriously difficult. He treated the staff not as people, but as extensions of the furniture, to be used, ignored, or berated at his whim. "Water," he grunted, without looking up from his phone as Clara approached. She filled his crystal goblet from a chilled carafe, her movement silent and fluid. He didn't acknowledge her. He was scrolling through stock tickers, his thumb moving with a predatory flick. The sommelier recommended the 98 Latour, Julian, one of his companions said, fawning. A perfect pairing for the Emperor's cut. Croft grunted again. He'd better. For what they're charging, that cow should have been serenaded to sleep every night by a string quartet. The men laughed. Clara's expression remained neutral, a carefully constructed mask of professional deference. But inside her mind, the mind of a scientist, was always observing, analyzing. She noted the way Croft held his fork, like a weapon. She noted the slight sheen of oil on his skin, indicative of high cortisol levels. She noted the way his gaze swept the room, not with appreciation, but with the cold assessment of an owner checking his inventory. The evening wore on. Clara served appetizers, oysters with a champagne mignonette, foie gras torchon with fig jam. With each course, Croft's dismissiveness grew into a more pointed cruelty. He sent back a salad because a frise leaf was, in his opinion, structurally unsound. He complained that his lobster bisque was a degree too tepid. Each complaint was delivered not to her, but to the table at large, as if she were a malfunctioning appliance. Clara absorbed the insults, her face a blank canvas. She had endured worse. She had endured Professor Albright telling her that her research into fraudulent food sourcing was a noble but unfundable crusade. This was just noise. Finally, the main event arrived. The kitchen doors swung open, and the head chef, Antoine, personally wheeled out a silver cloche on a gueridon. Beneath it was the crown jewel of Aurelia's menu, the Kobe A5 Plus, Emperor's Cut. It was a legend in the culinary world, sourced from a single, exclusive farm in Japan's Hyogo Prefecture. Each cut came with a certificate of authenticity, detailing the animal's lineage, its nose print, and a 10-digit identification number. The price was an eye-watering $800 for 10 ounces. It was less a meal and more a statement of status. Antoine, with a flourish, lifted the cloche. The steak was a masterpiece of nature and husbandry, a perfect rectangle of meat so intensely marbled with fat it was more white than red. The aroma was nutty, buttery, and profoundly rich. Monsieur Croft, Antoine said with a bow, the Emperor's Cut, seared on a Binchoton grill to a perfect medium rare. Croft didn't even look at the chef. He waved a dismissive hand. Just serve it. Antoine's face tightened, but he sliced the steak with surgical precision and plated it. As Clara placed the plate before Croft, her eyes, the sharp, analytical eyes of a scientist, caught something. It was infinitesimal, a detail that 999 out of 1,000 people would miss. The intramuscular fat, the famous sashi, was brilliant white, as it should be. But at the very edge of the cut, where the fat met the seared crust, there was a faint, almost imperceptible yellowish tinge. And the texture of the fibers, visible only where the knife had made its first cut, seemed just a fraction too coarse, the pattern of the marbling not quite as delicate and web-like as the authentic article she had studied in textbooks and lab samples. Her mind raced. Oxidation of lipids, she thought. Could be from improper storage, but the texture. Croft picked up his knife and fork. He took a bite. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. He took a sip of his wine. Then he placed his utensils down with a loud click. "This is garbage," he announced. The table fell silent. Antoine, who was still lingering nearby, froze. "Pardon, monsieur," the chef stammered. "It's tough. It's greasy. It tastes common," Croft sneered. "This isn't Emperor's Cut. This is some cheap knockoff you're trying to pass off on me. What do you take me for? Some tourist from Ohio?" Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. He was right, but for the wrong reasons. His palate, dulled by years of cigars and expensive scotch, hadn't detected the subtle chemical nuances she had. He had simply decided to be cruel, and by sheer dumb luck, his baseless accusation had stumbled upon a truth she was just beginning to suspect. "Monsieur, I assure you," Antoine began, his face pale. "I oversaw the preparation myself. This is from our supplier, certified and documented. Your supplier is a liar and you're an incompetent," Croft snapped. He then turned his cold eyes on Clara. "And you served this filth to me. You probably dropped it on the floor on the way out." He picked up his wine glass and, with a flick of his wrist, emptied the dregs of the dark red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth, inches from her hand. "Clean that up, and then get your manager. You're fired." The humiliation was a physical blow. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the public spectacle, the casual cruelty of the gesture. The other diners were now watching, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Clara stared at the dark red stain spreading across the linen, a blooming flower of shame. She could feel her composure, the carefully built wall of professionalism, beginning to crack. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's general manager, materialized at the table. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He lived in a perpetual state of appeasing the rich, and his entire career was built on the art of de-escalation. "Mr. Croft, is there a problem?" Dubois asked, his voice a smooth balm. "A problem?" "Dubois, your restaurant is engaged in fraud," Croft declared, his voice rising. "You served me a counterfeit steak, and this clumsy girl ruined my table. I want her gone, now, and I want this garbage taken off my bill. In fact, I'm not paying for any of this." Dubois looked from Croft's furious face to Clara's trembling hands. He saw a simple calculation: $1 billion client versus a 20-something waitress. It wasn't a choice. "Clara, go to the back," he said, his voice low but firm, avoiding her eyes. "I will handle this." "But sir, Clara started to protest. "Now," Dubois commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned back to Croft, his professional smile snapping back into place. "Mr. Croft, my deepest apologies. Of course, the entire meal is on the house. Let me get you a bottle of Louis XIII to amend for this misunderstanding." Clara stood frozen for a moment. She was being dismissed. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. She was the only one in the room who suspected the truth, yet she was being treated like the criminal. She looked at Croft, who was now leaning back in his booth, a triumphant smirk on his face. He had won. He had asserted his dominance. She took a step back, turned, and began to walk toward the kitchen. But then she stopped. The scientist in her, the part of her that believed in data, in truth, in empirical evidence, rebelled. Her thesis was on this very subject: the rampant, sophisticated fraud in the high-end food supply chain. She had spent 2 years studying the chromatography of beef lipids, the genetic markers of specific cattle breeds. To walk away now felt like a betrayal of everything she was working for. She turned back. The squeak of her shoes on the polished floor seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly hushed dining room. "Mr. Dubois," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "Please don't apologize to Mr. Croft." Dubois' eyes widened in disbelief. "Clara, what are you doing?" he hissed. Clara ignored him. She looked directly at Julian Croft, her fear transmuting into a cold, hard resolve. "He's right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You shouldn't have to pay for that steak, because it's not what you ordered." She took a breath, the point of no return. "That is not Emperor's cut Kobe beef. It's a very high-quality fake. But it is, as you so eloquently put it, garbage." The silence that descended upon Aurelia was profound. It was as if the city noise, the clinking of glasses, the very air itself had been sucked out of the room. Julian Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned fury. Mr. Dubois looked as if he was about to have a coronary. He had seen waitresses cry, he had seen them quit, but he had never, in his 30 years in the business, seen one openly defy the most powerful client in the restaurant. "What did you just say to me?" Croft's voice was a low, dangerous growl. He slowly pushed himself up from the booth, a man unused to being contradicted. "I said you're correct, sir," Clara replied, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice steady. She was no longer a waitress. She was a scientist presenting her findings. "The steak you were served is not from the Tajima-Gyu lineage. The lipid oxidation at the edges is inconsistent with the flash-searing process on Binchotan. The muscle fibers are too thick. It's likely a high-grade domestic Wagyu, possibly from a crossbreed, passed off as the real thing. It's fraud, but the fraud didn't begin in our kitchen." Croft stared at her, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Are you insane? You're babbling nonsense. Lipid what? Dubois, get this lunatic out of my sight before I call the police and have her arrested for harassment." "Clara, that's enough!" Dubois snapped, grabbing her arm. "You're fired. Get your things and leave, now!" But Clara pulled her arm away. "No," she said, looking at her manager with a newfound clarity. "You're so afraid of his money that you're willing to let him destroy my reputation and ignore a potential crime that affects your entire restaurant. The certificate of authenticity for that cut. May I see it?" Antoine, the chef, who had been watching from the side, looked at Dubois, who gave a frantic, dismissive shake of his head. But the chef's professional pride was stung. He was being called a fraud. He disappeared into the kitchen and returned a moment later with a laminated document, which he handed to Clara. Clara's eyes scanned the certificate. It looked perfect. The official seal, the Japanese characters, the 10-digit ID number, Walhina 588-21-457. "It looks legitimate," she said, "but these numbers can be cloned from older, authentic certificates. There's only one way to be sure." She reached into the small pocket of her apron, a pocket where she usually kept a pen and a notepad. But tonight, she pulled out something else. It was her phone. "What are you going to do, Google it?" Croft sneered, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. "Go ahead. Entertain us." "Something like that," Clara said. She didn't open a web browser. She opened a specific app, one she had designed herself as part of her doctoral research. It was a simple interface connected to a global database she had been painstakingly building, cross-referencing auction records, farm registries, and import manifests. She typed in the 10-digit number. The screen loaded. A picture of a magnificent black bull appeared, along with its entire lineage. Certificate ID 14588-21057. Authentic. Croft let out a triumphant roar of laughter. "See, the little girl and her toy phone. She's a liar and an idiot. You are finished in this town, sweetheart. I will personally see to it that you never serve a cup of coffee again." Dubois buried his face in his hands. The entire dining room was watching, their phones now discreetly pointed toward the unfolding drama. But Clara wasn't looking at them. She was scrolling down the screen, her brow furrowed. "The certificate is real," she said softly. "But there's a problem." She looked up, her gaze locking onto Croft, then sweeping to Dubois and Antoine. This specific cut from this specific animal was part of Lot 7B. It was sold at auction 6 weeks ago to a restaurant consortium in Dubai. She held up the phone. "And according to the import records and the blockchain ledger I have access to, Lot 7B was flagged and destroyed by UAE customs officials 4 weeks ago due to a listeria contamination." The air in the room went cold. The word listeria hung in the air like a toxic spore. Fraud was one thing. A foodborne illness scandal at a 2-Michelin-star restaurant was another. It was a death sentence. "That's impossible," Antoine whispered, his face ashen. "Our supplier, he's the most reputable on the continent." "Then your reputable supplier has some explaining to do," Clara said. She turned her phone toward Mr. Dubois. "Sir, I think you need to make a phone call, and I suggest you do it before Mr. Croft's other guests take another bite of their food." Suddenly, the drama wasn't about a rude customer and an insubordinate waitress anymore. It was about public health. It was about a multi-million-dollar deception. The smirk was gone from Julian Croft's face, replaced by a look of dawning horror as he glanced down at the half-eaten piece of meat on his plate. Dubois stared at Clara, his mind reeling. The girl he was about to throw out into the street had just calmly, methodically, and with terrifying certainty deployed a nuclear bomb in the middle of his dining room. He looked at the phone in her hand, at the data on the screen, and then at the panicked faces of the other diners who had overheard. He had made a choice just minutes ago, siding with power and money. He now realized, with a sickening lurch in his gut, that he had backed the wrong horse. "Get the owner on the phone," he croaked to a nearby captain, his voice trembling. "Tell her it's a code red. Tell her to get here now." Julian Croft, for the first time in what was likely decades, was speechless. His power, his influence, his carefully cultivated aura of invincibility had just been rendered utterly irrelevant by a waitress with a smartphone and a PhD-level knowledge of beef. The table he had commanded was no longer a throne. It was a crime scene. The 20 minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The atmosphere in Aurelia had shifted from hushed elegance to a thick, anxious tension. Word had spread through the dining room like a contagion. Diners who had ordered the beef were looking at their plates with suspicion, some pushing them away with barely concealed disgust. The staff moved with a nervous, stilted energy, unsure of what to do. Julian Croft and his guests sat in a stunned silence at booth 12. The celebratory mood curdled into a miasma of dread. Clara stood near the maitre d's station, a solitary figure in the eye of the storm. Mr. Dubois had asked her to wait, his tone a mixture of awe and terror. He kept glancing at her, as if she were an unexploded ordnance. He had made a few frantic calls to the kitchen, and the Emperor's cut was immediately pulled from the menu, the remaining stock quarantined. Croft, recovering from his initial shock, was now seething. The humiliation of being upstaged was warring with the primal fear of having ingested contaminated food. He was on his phone, his voice a low, furious hiss. "I don't care what it costs. Get Dr. Silverstein on the line. I want a full medical team at my apartment in an hour. And get my lawyer. Get him now. We're going to sue this place into a crater." He was trying to reclaim control, to reshape the narrative from one of his public humiliation to one of his victimhood. But the power had already shifted. No one was looking at him with deference anymore. They were looking at Clara. The main doors of the restaurant opened, admitting a gust of wind and a woman who commanded the attention of the room without saying a word. This was not a manager or a security guard. This was Genevieve Sterling, in her late 60s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a face that held the wisdom of 1,000 balance sheets. She was the reclusive, almost mythical owner of the Sterling Restaurant Group, a global empire of fine dining establishments, of which Aurelia was the flagship. She rarely visited her properties, preferring to manage her empire from a quiet estate in the countryside. For her to appear on a rainy Tuesday night meant that the situation was catastrophic. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored black pantsuit, her only adornment a single large pearl brooch. She moved with a quiet, purposeful stride, her sharp blue eyes sweeping the room, taking in the panicked staff, the anxious diners, and the disaster zone at booth 12. Mr. Dubois intercepted her, his face slick with sweat. "Miss Sterling, thank God you're here. It's a situation." "I gathered that, Robert," she said, her voice calm and cool, cutting through his panic. "Give me the summary." 30 seconds. Dubois stammered through the explanation. Croft's complaint, the waitress's defiance, the phone, the certificate, the word listeria. Genevieve Sterling's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. She walked past Dubois, past Croft's table, and stopped directly in front of Clara. She didn't look at Clara as an employee. She looked at her as a variable she needed to understand. "You are Clara Evans?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said, her voice steady. "You're a doctoral candidate in food science at the University of Chicago, specializing in supply chain integrity. Your funding was cut last semester after your advisor, Dr. Albright, deemed your research commercially unviable." Clara was stunned into silence. How could she possibly know that? Sterling offered a faint, thin smile. "I make it my business to know who is working in my establishments, Miss Evans, especially the overqualified ones. I read the abstract of your proposed thesis 6 months ago. It was brilliant. Albright is a fool." She turned her gaze toward booth 12. "Show me the data on your phone." Clara unlocked her phone and handed it to her. Sterling studied the screen for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. She scrolled through the blockchain ledger, her lips a thin, tight line. "This is your proprietary app?" she asked, looking up. "Yes. It scrapes public import logs and cross-references them with private auction house data. The blockchain ledger is the key. It provides an immutable record of custody," Clara explained, the scientist in her taking over. "Impressive," Sterling murmured. She handed the phone back. Then she turned and walked to booth 12. Julian Croft, seeing the owner, the true seat of power, stood up. "Genevieve," he said, attempting a familiar, commanding tone. "This is an outrage. Your staff has tried to poison me, and this girl has been completely insubordinate. I expect—" "Sit down, Julian," Sterling said, her voice quiet but laced with steel. Croft, shocked by the command, actually sat. "Let me be perfectly clear," Sterling continued, addressing the table but speaking loudly enough for the surrounding diners to hear. "My preliminary assessment, based on the evidence provided by my colleague, Miss Evans, suggests that this restaurant has been the victim of a sophisticated fraud by one of our primary suppliers. A fraud that has potentially endangered the health of my guests." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Therefore, Aurelia will be closing immediately for a full internal and external investigation. We will be contacting the FDA and the Department of Health first thing in the morning. Every guest here tonight will, of course, have their meal comped, and we will be in touch with each of you personally tomorrow to arrange for precautionary medical consultations at our expense." It was a masterclass in crisis management. In one swift move, she had taken control, demonstrated transparency, and shifted the blame to an external source, all while positioning herself as the protector of her clients. "Now," she said, her cool gaze finally landing on Croft, "I understand you were abusive to my staff and publicly humiliated Miss Evans, who was, in fact, trying to protect you and everyone else in this room." "I was a customer complaining about a subpar product," Croft blustered, his face flushed. "You were a bully on a power trip," Sterling corrected him coldly. "You demanded Miss Evans be fired. Consider it an early retirement package for yourself. Your corporate account with the Sterling Group is terminated. Your personal membership is revoked. You are no longer welcome in any of my establishments, anywhere in the world." Croft's jaw dropped. He was being blacklisted. For a man whose entire life was built on access and exclusivity, it was a stunning blow. "You can't do that," he stammered. "I'm Julian Croft. I know who you are," Sterling said. "And right now, you are a man who is trespassing. Security will escort you out." Two large men in dark suits appeared as if from nowhere and stood behind Croft's chair. His sycophantic guests began to shrink away, suddenly desperate to distance themselves from him. "This is insane!" Croft yelled as the security guards took his arms. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers. I'll own this building." "Please try," Sterling said with a dismissive wave. "My legal team is excellent. They enjoy a challenge." As Julian Croft was marched unceremoniously through the dining room, a man stripped of his power and prestige, a smattering of applause broke out from the other tables. He was a spectacle of deflated ego, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The room was buzzing. Genevieve Sterling stood for a moment, a silent commander surveying her ship in a storm. Then she turned back to Clara. The other staff members watched, holding their breath. They all expected Sterling to now turn her ire on the waitress who had caused this public relations nightmare. "Miss Evans," Sterling said, her tone all business. "Walk with me." She led Clara away from the gawking diners toward the quiet hallway that led to the private offices. "You have a choice to make," Sterling said as they walked, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. "What you did tonight was reckless. It could have bankrupted this restaurant if I hadn't handled it correctly. But it was also brilliant. You have a remarkable mind and a spine of steel, qualities I value far more than deference." They stopped in front of a heavy oak door. "I am dissolving our contract with our current meat supplier, and likely several others, effective immediately. I am launching a complete overhaul of my entire global supply chain. I need someone to lead it, someone who understands the science, the data, and the deception. Someone I can trust implicitly." She turned to face Clara directly. "Dr. Albright was wrong. Your research isn't just viable, it's invaluable. I will fund the remainder of your PhD, all of it. Consider it a signing bonus. When you graduate, the position of Global Director of Quality and Sourcing for the Sterling Restaurant Group is yours. You will report directly to me. You will build your own lab. You will have an unlimited budget. You will ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Clara was speechless. Her world had tilted on its axis. An hour ago, she was a broke graduate student about to be fired. Now, she was being offered her dream job, the ultimate validation of her life's work, by one of the most powerful women in the culinary world. I don't know what to say," Clara stammered. "Say yes," Sterling said simply. "But not tonight. Tonight, you are an employee who has had a very difficult evening. Go home. Get some rest. My office will call you in the morning to draw up the contracts." She paused, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips. "And Clara, find a new place to work for the next year. You're far too tiets." The rain had not ceased. It fell in silver, percussive sheets against the glass of the taxi, blurring the Chicago skyline into a Monet of bleeding neon. Clara sat in the back, her uniform now feeling less like a costume of servitude and more like the shed skin of a former self. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins like a live wire in the restaurant had receded, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion and a silence so deep it felt louder than the storm outside. She was not elated. She was not triumphant. She was hollowed out, a vessel scoured clean by the sheer, terrifying velocity of the night's events. Genevieve Sterling's words echoed in the humming quiet of the car. You have a remarkable mind and a spine of steel. The praise felt alien, a diagnosis delivered to a stranger, the person who had faced down Julian Croft, who had calmly detonated a Michelin-starred restaurant with a string of numbers on a phone, was not the same person who now watched her own reflection flicker in the rain-streaked window. That person in the glass looked haunted, her eyes wide with the shock of her own potential. The squeak of her shoes, a sound she had loathed for its association with deference and invisibility, had been silenced by the damp carpet of the taxi. But she could still hear it in her mind. It was no longer the sound of a beginning, of a promising road. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a life she understood. The simple, binary existence of lab by day, waitress by night was gone. In its place was a vast, undefined territory, a continent of expectation she had just been handed a map to, with a single, daunting destination marked success. She felt an acute, aching nostalgia for the girl who had walked into Aurelia that evening, the girl whose greatest anxieties were a difficult customer and the looming deadline for a thesis no one believed in. That girl was safe in her obscurity. This new Clara Evans was terrifyingly visible. The taxi pulled up to her cramped apartment building in Hyde Park. The driver, a kind-faced man with tired eyes, turned around. "That'll be $22.50, hun." Clara fumbled in her purse, her hand still shaking slightly. She pulled out a wad of crumpled cash from her tips. She saw a 20, a 5, a few ones. The mundane reality of the transaction was a shock to her system. She had just been offered a future with an unlimited budget, yet here she was, counting out crumpled bills to pay for a ride home. The dissonance was dizzying. She handed the driver $30. "Keep it," she murmured. Inside her apartment, the silence was absolute. Her textbooks were stacked neatly on her desk, her notes on lipid chromatography spread out like the artifacts of a forgotten civilization. This room, this life, had been her entire world. Now it felt like a diorama. She shed the black uniform, letting it fall to the floor in a heap, and stood under the weak stream of a hot shower, the water washing away the scent of truffle oil and fear. She wasn't washing away the night. She was trying to feel its reality, to let the heat convince her that she hadn't dreamt the entire surreal episode. But as the steam filled the tiny bathroom, she saw not her own reflection in the fogged-up mirror, but the furious, contorted face of Julian Croft. And for the first time that night, a tremor of pure, cold fear ran through her. She hadn't just proven a point. She had made a mortal enemy of a very powerful man, or at least a man who had been. The thought offered little comfort. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. The year that followed was not a victory lap. It was a crucible. Genevieve Sterling was a patron, not a friend. Her generosity was an investment, and she expected a return. The funding materialized instantly, a staggering sum that made Clara's university bursar stammer. Professor Albright, his academic opportunism sensing a paradigm shift, appeared at her lab door with a bottle of mediocre champagne and a proposal to co-author a paper on her groundbreaking methodology. Clara looked at the man who had called her life's work a noble but unfundable crusade, saw the naked ambition in his eyes, and felt a weariness that went bone deep. "Thank you, Professor," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "But my research is now proprietary." The look on his face was a small, bitter satisfaction in a sea of overwhelming pressure. Sterling installed her not in a university lab, but in a sterile, windowless facility, in an unmarked corporate park in the suburbs. It was a place of immense technological power and profound isolation. Gone were the collaborative chaos of university life, the shared coffee breaks, the arguments over methodology with fellow students. Here, she was the sole authority. She was given a team of quiet, efficient software engineers and data analysts who called her Dr. Evans, a title she had not yet earned, and looked at her with a mixture of awe and professional distance. They executed her commands, but they did not share her passion. The work was her own, a solitary burden. There were days she felt like a fraud, an imposter playing the role of a genius. The Sterling Protocol, as the marketing department had already branded it, was a mountain of logistical impossibilities. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a project manager, a supply chain theorist, a cryptographer, and a diplomat. She spent weeks on video calls with grizzled, skeptical ranchers in Argentina who didn't trust blockchain, a word that sounded to them like a piece of farm equipment. She argued with fishermen in Hokkaido about the battery life of temperature sensors on their boats. She discovered that truth in the real world was not a clean data point. It was messy, complicated, and fiercely guarded by people whose livelihoods depended on the old, opaque systems. The ghost of Julian Croft lingered. His downfall had been spectacular and swift. The media narrative had painted him as a cartoon villain, a modern-day Midas whose touch turned everything to garbage. The story of Prime Provisions, his secret, fraudulent meat processing company, had been the final, fatal blow. The Lakeshore Spire project collapsed. His company was carved up and sold for parts to pay the fines and lawsuits. He had vanished from the public eye, a ghost in the city he once haunted. But for Clara, he was more than a headline. He was a cautionary tale. She saw his arrogance reflected in the corporate world she now inhabited. She saw his hunger for control in the precise, demanding memos she received from Genevieve Sterling. Sterling was not cruel like Croft, but her power was more absolute, more insidious. It was a velvet glove, but the fist inside was iron. She was shaping Clara, molding her into an asset, a weapon in her corporate arsenal. "Certainty is the ultimate luxury, Clara," Sterling had told her during one of their weekly check-ins, "and we are going to monopolize it." Clara felt a growing unease. She had fought for truth, but she was beginning to realize that in Sterling's world, truth was a commodity. It was a brand. She would lie awake at night in her new, sterile corporate apartment, the silence of the suburbs pressing in on her, and wonder if she had simply traded one cage for another, more gilded one. She had escaped the squeaking shoes of a waitress, only to find herself walking silently in the sound-proofed corridors of power, and she wasn't sure which was more confining. Julian Croft sat in the architecture of silence. His penthouse, once a stage for his power, was now a mausoleum. The floor-to-ceiling windows still offered their god-like view of the city, but the skyline no longer looked like his kingdom. It looked like a photograph of someone else's life. The Vacheron Constantin watch sat on his bedside table, its intricate movements still tracking a time that no longer mattered. His custom-made suits hung in his closet like forgotten costumes. The first few weeks after the Aurelia incident had been a blur of frantic phone calls, legal battles, and the sickening, vertiginous sensation of the world falling out from under him. He had lost everything: the money, the company, the sycophants, the fear he inspired. But the true loss, the one that had hollowed him out, was the loss of his own reflection. He had spent his life constructing an identity, Julian Croftem, a brand built on invincibility and ruthless success. When that was stripped away, he discovered with a horror that bordered on psychosis that there was nothing underneath. He didn't think about Clara Evans. To think of her would be to acknowledge her as the agent of his destruction, and his ego, even in its shattered state, could not permit that. No, he thought about the stake. He obsessed over it. In his mind, the Emperor's cut became a symbol of his own life. Something that looked perfect on the outside, certified and priceless, but was, at its core, a cheap, chemically enhanced fraud. He had built an empire on leverage, on loopholes, on creating the perception of value where none existed. He had sold the world a counterfeit version of success, and he had been his own best customer. The waitress hadn't exposed a fraudulent piece of meat. She had held up a mirror. His sneer, his rage in the restaurant. It wasn't the fury of a connoisseur detecting a flaw. It was the primal terror of the imposter, screaming at his own reflection just before the glass shattered. He stopped answering the door. He let the calls go to voicemail. He lived on scotch and the diminishing contents of his pantry. He would stand for hours in front of the window, watching the endless flow of traffic 75 floors below, and feel nothing. He was a ghost, haunting the crime scene of his own life. The city was a feast he could no longer taste. He finally understood the meaning of the word garbage. It wasn't the steak. It was the gaping, insatiable hunger of his own soul. One day, months into his self-imposed exile, his lawyer, the last person still paid to talk to him, managed to get through. His voice was tired. "Julian, you have to sign the final papers. The bankruptcy is settled. They're taking the apartment." Julian looked around the vast, empty space. "Let them," he whispered, and hung up the phone. He packed a single bag, put on a simple pair of trousers and a shirt, clothes he hadn't worn in decades, and walked out of the building, not even glancing back. He was no longer Julian Croft. He was just a man named Jay, walking into a city that had already forgotten him. The day of the launch arrived. Hangar 5 at a private airfield had been transformed. Genevieve Sterling did not do things by halves. The space was a cathedral of brushed steel and cool blue light, a temple dedicated to the new religion of truth. The world's culinary press, celebrity chefs, and food industry titans mingled, sipping champagne and murmuring in hushed, reverent tones. Clara stood backstage, her hands cold. She wore a simple dark blue dress and a white lab coat, a deliberate choice. She was not a corporate executive. She was a scientist. She looked at her reflection in a polished panel. The woman looking back was different. The exhaustion was still there, deep in her eyes, but it was overlaid with a hard-won confidence. She was no longer haunted by the girl she had been, nor was she fully the woman Sterling wanted her to be. She was something new, forged in the silent pressure of the past year. Mr. Dubois found her there. He was greyer, thinner, but his eyes had lost their hunted look. Sterling had given him a new role, heading up a new, group-wide training initiative. "Dignity is not a line item on a budget," he'd told Clara once, a mantra he now taught to every new hire. He handed her a small bottle of water. "You look nervous," he said, his voice gentle. "I feel like I'm about to defend my thesis to the entire world," she confessed with a small smile. "You already did that a year ago, in front of a much tougher audience," he replied. He looked out at the crowd. "He taught me something that night, you know. Croft. I spent my whole life appeasing men like him. I thought their power was real. But it's not. It's a performance. You didn't just challenge him, Clara. You walked off the stage. You showed everyone that the play was ridiculous." He gave her a respectful nod. "Break a leg, Doctor." Clara walked onto the stage to a polite smattering of applause. The lights were blinding. A massive screen behind her glowed with the elegant logo of the Sterling Protocol. She saw Genevieve Sterling in the front row, her expression cool, proud, proprietary. "For centuries," Clara began, her voice steady, amplified through the hangar, "the story of our food has been told to us by a menu. It's a story of trust. We trust the farmer, the supplier, the chef. But trust is an abstract concept. It can be manipulated, it can be broken, and when it breaks, the result is, at best, disappointment. At worst, it is a betrayal." She clicked a remote. The screen behind her changed, showing not data, but a simple, powerful image. A farmer's weathered hands holding a handful of rich soil. "I am a scientist," she continued, her voice gaining passion, veering slightly from the approved script Sterling's PR team had written for her. "I believe in data. I believe in empirical evidence. The Sterling Protocol provides that. It is a system of radical transparency, tracking every ingredient from its origin to your plate, secured on an immutable ledger. We are replacing the abstract idea of trust with the concrete fact of truth." She demonstrated the technology. She scanned a QR code on a beautiful, marbled piece of beef. The screen instantly populated with a staggering amount of information: the animal's genetics, its diet, the name of the farmer who raised it, the carbon footprint of its journey. The audience murmured in appreciation. This was the future. "This system," she said, looking directly at Genevieve Sterling, "provides certainty. It is a remarkable tool, but that is all it is. A tool. The goal is not just to create a new definition of luxury, to sell certainty to the highest bidder." Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The goal is to restore something more fundamental: connection. To know the story of your food is to know the people who grew it, the land that nourished it. It is to understand that a meal is not a transaction. It is the end of a long, human story. Honesty," she concluded, her eyes sweeping across the audience, "is not a luxury. It should be the standard, and today we are making it one." The applause was thunderous. As the crowd surged forward to the demonstration tables, Sterling approached her, her blue eyes like chips of ice. "A beautiful speech, Clara. You added a populist touch I wasn't expecting." "It's what I believe," Clara said simply. "I know," Sterling replied, a thin smile playing on her lips. "That's why I hired you. Just remember who built the church before you start rewriting the sermon. The message was clear. You are brilliant, but you are mine." As the event wound down, Clara felt a need to escape the noise and the congratulations. She found a side door that led out onto the tarmac. The evening air was cool. In the distance, the lights of Chicago glittered. She had done it. She had built the system, honored her promise. But the quiet warning from Sterling left a bitter taste in her mouth. The fight wasn't over. It had just changed form. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the service entrance. A man in the rumpled uniform of a catering company, his shoulders slumped. He was older, heavier, his face puffy and anonymous. But she knew him instantly. It was Julian Croft, or the man who used to be. He just stood there, about 20 feet away, not threatening, not angry. He looked lost. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, a primal flight-or-fight response kicking in. But he made no move. He just looked at her, his eyes holding not malice, but a vast, empty bewilderment. "They call you doctor now," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp, barely carrying on the wind. It was the voice of a stranger. "I saw you on the stage, on the monitor in the kitchen." Clara said nothing. Her scientific mind took over, observing, analyzing, the signs of chronic alcohol use, the poor muscle tone, the cheap, worn-out shoes. "I needed to ask you something," he said, taking a hesitant step forward. That night, at the restaurant, you knew. Before you even tasted it, you knew. He wasn't accusing her. He was asking, how? What did you see? It was the last question she ever expected. He wasn't there for revenge. He was there for data. He was a man trying to understand the precise mechanics of his own ruin. Clara took a breath. She owed him nothing. She could call security. But looking at the hollowed-out man before her, she felt not pity, but a strange, clinical empathy. He was a failed experiment, and he wanted to know where the calculations had gone wrong. The lipid oxidation, she said, her voice quiet and clear. The intramuscular fat at the edge of the cut had a yellowish tinge. It's a sign of decay, inconsistent with the Binchotan searing process. And the muscle striations were too coarse for Tajima-Gyu lineage. The marbling was good, but it was chaotic. The real thing is like a fractal, a perfect, delicate web. That was just noise. He listened, nodding slowly, as if she were explaining a complex law of physics that had governed his fall. He seemed to find a strange comfort in the cold, hard science of it all. It had been chemistry, not magic, an observable, quantifiable failure. Noise, he repeated softly. He looked down at his own hands, then back up at her. All of it. It was all just noise. He finally understood. He stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Then he turned without another word and walked away, a ghost disappearing back into the anonymous service corridors of the city. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a variable that had been solved for. Clara watched him go. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound, quiet sorrow for a life so spectacularly wasted. She turned back toward the glittering hangar, toward the new world she had built, the world of truth and certainty. She knew her work was not about destroying men like Croft. It was about building a world where men like him could no longer exist. She walked back inside, leaving the cold night air behind. The squeak of her old shoes was a distant memory, replaced now by the quiet, confident hum of servers processing immutable data. The sound of a million tiny, verifiable truths being told, all at once. It was the sound of her work, and it was just beginning.